Throughout the 1950s and 60s, one of the United States' primary focuses had been the containment of communism, meaning they wanted to prevent the worldwide spread of communist government. On July 21, 1954, the Geneva Accords decided to grant Vietnam its independence from France and provide a temporary boundary between North and South Vietnam at the 17th parallel. North Vietnam continued its communist practices, as South Vietnam declared itself the Republic of Vietnam. Following the idea of containment, the U.S. decided to support South Vietnam in its constant disputes with the Communists. In August of 1964, two U.S. destroyers sitting off the coast of South Vietnam in the Gulf of Tonkin suddenly found themselves under the attack of North Vietnamese vessels. This occurrence, known as the Gulf of Tonkin incident, gave President Johnson the right to protect American troops in Vietnam with whatever means he felt necessary. On March 2, 1965, the U.S. military decided to launch a sustained aerial bombing campaign of North Vietnam, known as Operation Rolling Thunder. Only 6 days later, the first American combat troops had arrived in Vietnam. In January of 1968, the North Vietnamese decided to join forces with the communist guerrilla movement known as the Viet Cong. The combined group eventually launched the Tet Offensive, attacking approximately 100 South Vietnamese cities and towns. In retaliation, U.S. soldiers killed hundreds of Vietnamese civilians in the town of My Lai, which became known as the My Lai Massacre. That same year, U.S. troops in Vietnam had reached over 500,000. However, as controversies in Vietnam began to slow down and nationwide anti-war protests had taken effect, President Nixon ordered the first of many U.S. troop withdrawals from Vietnam in July of 1969. The next year, President Nixon expanded the war ground by launching an attack on North Vietnamese sanctuaries in Cambodia. This sparked nationwide disapproval and increased anti-war protests, especially on U.S. college campuses. In March of 1972, the North Vietnamese had crossed the demilitarized zone at the 17th parallel to attack South Vietnam in what became known as the Easter Offensive. Just the next year, the last U.S. troops had been withdrawn from Vietnam, and by 1975, South Vietnam had surrendered from the Communists. To this day, the topic of the Vietnam War still conveys distasteful emotions and difference of opinion. Costing around $580 billion and 50,000 lives, the war constantly perplexes the American mindset. Not only was it another country's war, but the Vietnam War also resulted in the U.S.'s only defeat thus far.